nice to see a lot of friends here. And I'm wondering if any of our friends here have been to Russia. We're very curious as to how common it is for folks here in the opera community to go to Russia. You may see some familiar spots, although I bet none of you have been to Astrakhan, because Astrakhan is a bit out of the way. But we had a very interesting fall semester on a Fulbright grant to take us to Astrakhan State Technical University. Here we are with the obligatory Alfred Sun shot that we sent back and that you may have seen in the Alfred Sun in the fall. The university is about 10,000 students. It's part of the federal university system. We were not aware of any public education that's done by the oblasts or the provinces in Russia. They're all part of the federal educational system. It was known locally by the Russian acronym AGTU. And just to help you to locate yourself geographically, Astrakhan is here, about 800 miles southeast of Moscow. It's still part of European Russia. The Ural Mountains here separate the European portion of Russia from the larger Asian portion. But it's in a place that has some distinctives for Europe. It's the lowest and the warmest place in Europe, and also the driest place in Europe. I'll take back the warmest. It's the driest and lowest. The entire area here that is in dark green says Caspian Depression is below sea level. The Caspian Basin is sort of like the Dead Sea or some other inland water basins in the world. It's the largest inland lake in the world. It's not fresh water because the water never reaches the ocean. There's no drainage. So like the Dead Sea or some other places, evaporation is the only exit for water that runs into the Caspian. The Caspian is fed by two major rivers, the Volga, which comes out of central Russia, and the Ural, which comes out of the Ural Mountains area. But there's almost no input from the southern part of the Caspian. So the southern Caspian especially is more salty. The northern part of the Caspian less so. The elevation of the city of Astrakhan, which is located right here, is about 90 feet below sea level. So the Volga empties into the Caspian and spreads out into a very large delta at that point, and Astrakhan is located at that delta point. Here's a Russian map that shows the city of Astrakhan and the delta. This is the Volga River Basin itself, river valley, and it starts to spread out into the delta, at least 800 channels. The channels are shifting constantly. So the entire delta area is quite wet and quite unstable. So the city itself is built on a little drier area. But the city itself is built on about 11 islands and has several branches of the Volga spreading out within the city that have been channelized and are now canals, similar to what you see in St. Petersburg or even in Venice. So it's sometimes compared with those two cities as being a city built on wetlands, and in which the river and the wetlands sort of dominate the city. Also, the international border with Kazakhstan is right here. So the city is only about 30 miles or so from what was formerly part of the Soviet Union, one of the other Soviet Union republics that's now an independent country. And just to back up for a second, wrong button. The other cities in the Caspian, the other countries in the Caspian Basin, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Azerbaijan, are the other countries that share this area. And Astrakhan calls itself the capital of the Caspian. They are the major trade center, the major port city, and one of the best developed areas on the Caspian Sea. But they are the city is Russia's frontier with the Orient, and it's a major trade area with these other countries around the Caspian. Here's a close-up aerial photograph that has some buildings marked on it that shows the part of the city that we lived in. Here is the main body of the Volga River, which is Mississippi-sized, incidentally, and is similar to that in terms of length and number of gallons of flow as well. A large island there. Here's one of the canals that goes around the city and that establishes this area as an island. There are two large bridges that come in from the west. The main city of Astrakhan, especially the historic area, built on the east bank. And our area where we hung out most of the time was this area here. Our apartment building was this L-shaped building here. The university complex, university compound, or campus where I taught is located here with a sports arena, track, and a main administration building, and some other buildings there as well. So I didn't have more than a 5-minute walk to campus on a regular basis. We lived in a very large Soviet-era apartment complex of those classic 5-story, all cement masonry buildings. A 4th-floor walk-up was our apartment. But we were within walking distance of the Volga itself, about 5 blocks out to the Volga River. We liked to go out there and walk, especially in the morning, a very pleasant walk, and we could watch a lot of fishermen along the edge of the Volga River. The main city's railroad line and railroad station were this area here.
АГТУ является развитие международного сотрудничества, обмен педагогического и образовательного.
The university where I taught had a television production program, and so they had an on-campus television station, and the students did a weekly news sort of a video magazine called Campus. And I was the subject of a 2-minute clip on one of the campus events in late September. And so I'll just show you a minute or so of this to give you a flavor of the campus, showing some of the students and showing me in the classroom with my students as well.
АГТУ является развитие международного сотрудничества. Обмен педагогического и образовательного опыта стал целью визита в университет профессора Джона Бакволтера, преподавателя Государственного университета города Нью-Йорка. Он не просто так приехал познакомиться с вузом. Целый семестр профессор биологии будет вести занятия у студентов АГТУ. Такая возможность предоставлена.
I wonder if any of you read Cyrillic. That says John David Buckwalter. Professor Biology at State University, New York, it says at the bottom.
Ставилась благодаря получению гранта по программе Fulbright. Год назад профессор подал.
And this is Sveta, my translator. Sveta was with me at all times in the classroom. I taught in English. We just learned enough Russian to survive in the marketplace and to say thank you and please and the pleasantries when we meet people and so forth. But we were certainly not conversational in Russian. The students, even though all of them had 2 or 3 years of English in school, were also not conversational in English. But it was to their advantage to learn more English. And so they appreciated the fact of having a native English-speaking professor in the classroom. I used PowerPoints and sent my PowerPoints off to Sveta a day before the class met so she could work up some of the translation and technical terms that she needed to have. But she worked very well. She was an English major at Moscow State University and was a very competent translator. I had 3 different classes that met in the same classroom in the Department of Applied Biology and Microbiology.
Заявку на поездку в Россию, но он не знал, в какой город, в какой университет его пригласят. И вот буквально недавно, этой весной, ему сообщили, что он приезжает в Астрахань.
Джон Бакволтер в АГТУ читает.
And I taught 3 classes. This is the graduate level class that I taught in the history of the scientific method, which was a new area for me to teach. I've always been fascinated with history and the history of science, and I got a chance to put this all together for a group of master's level students, all female. The guy standing on the right was my Russian co-teacher. So his name was Vladimir. He was in the biology department. We became good friends, even though we couldn't converse much directly. His English was quite limited. But we did become friends, and we're now Facebook friends as well. But Vladimir was there in the class with me at all times and helped Sveta with some of the technical vocabulary especially. But we did find that much of the biological vocabulary, especially of genetics and molecular biology, transliterated directly without the need for any translation. It was sounded out phonetically in Russian just like it would sound in English with a few vowel sound changes, of course, as well. But since I only had a 90-day visa, I couldn't complete the semester myself. We had to leave on November 29th. We're very strict about observing the 90-day visa. We left on November 29th with about 4 weeks of classes left. So Vladimir finished up the course, and I left him with some final exam questions. And then the students took a break from about December 26th or 27th until mid-January to observe the New Year, which comes first, and then Russian Christmas, which is on January 7th. Then they come back and take their final exams. The final exams are all orals. That's pretty much the situation throughout the Russian higher education system. And the way I found out that it works is that the students are given maybe 15 or 20 questions to study from. And these are big, large-scale questions. And then they come into the exam time one-on-one with the professor and draw 3 or 4 questions out of the hat. And they have to answer those questions on the spot orally with the faculty member. So there's no chance for bluffing, no chance for cheating at that time. They need to learn the entire subject material because usually the questions are comprehensive enough to cover everything. So I left questions with Vladimir before I left for all of my courses. The second class I taught was genetic engineering to fifth-year students. The standard higher education degree, initial degree in Russia for years has been the specialist degree. It's a degree that, as far as I know, doesn't exist outside of Russia. It's a 5-year program instead of a 4-year program. And so these are fifth-year students preparing to spend their spring semester just doing a thesis and a research project. So the specialist degree does include a master's type thesis that they must defend. So they had their last day of classes while we were there, and they celebrated that event with a special Russian celebration called the Last Bell. And my third class was a 4th-year group of students in microbial genetics. You can see that all 3 of these classes were quite small. My impression was that most upper-level classes, non-introductory level, were in the neighborhood of 10 to 12 students, which was a pleasure for a teacher to work with, certainly, but also gave you an opportunity for a bit more interaction in the classroom, although that was limited in our case by the language differences we had to work with. But a couple of the students, especially international students, spoke more English than others did. You notice in a couple of these photos that there were African students present. These are international students from Africa. ASTU, the technical university where I taught, said they had about 500 international students. And a good number of those were from several different countries in Africa, especially Zambia. We met students from Ivory Coast and Cameroon as well. And they come to Russia because they're only charged about $2,000 a year for all the expenses of higher education. So they can live in a rudimentary dormitory, make their own meals, in most cases, in the dormitory, and pay tuition for equivalent of $2,000 a year. We got to know a couple of the international students at the graduate level quite well, one from Zambia, one from Kazakhstan. They had both learned good English before they came, and then they learned Russian there, and so they served as translators and companions for us when we were going around the town, going to museums, going shopping, and other places. Now Laurel's going to talk about what she did for 3 months in Russia.
I had hoped to be able to do a lot more than what I was able to do in Russia. It appeared that the Russian system was not real flexible for making adjustments for new possibilities. So I felt that I had a lot of free time, and so I was glad to fill it with whatever I could find that was useful. And so several evenings during our time there, we went to a club that was to learn English. It was taught by our friend in the purple shirt there, Talgat, who was from Kazakhstan. And so these were students who had a real strong interest in learning English, and so we just went in for conversation, for questions, and had a really great time talking with them. Many of these are medical students at the medical school in Astrakhan. I had spoken to the English department on campus about my availability, willingness to work with students one-on-one or in a classroom situation, or even to tutor or help with papers and that kind of stuff. And I ended up with one class of conversation for a business English class. And so these are just 2 of the students that were in that class, and we just met every week and talked that class was only 6 students, and many times some of them did not all show up. So sometimes I had 2, sometimes I had 3. But I found it very interesting because we talked about anything that came to mind. And they asked me questions, and I asked them pretty open-ended questions, and I learned a good bit through that. We attended a Seventh-day Adventist church in Astrakhan. We were quite surprised to find that denomination there. It appears that there are a large number of Seventh-day Adventists in the city. There's also a Pentecostal church in Astrakhan, as well as a lot of the Russian Orthodox Church. And one of the Zambian students that we met early on spoke excellent English, and he invited us to come to church with him and be our translator. So that worked out well, because it's hard to go to church when you don't understand a word of what's being said. So these are ladies from that church who were interested in learning some English. And so we met once or twice a week. The girl on the left is the wife of the Zambian student. She was half Kazakh and her father was from Africa, from Cameroon. And so they became fairly good friends of ours, and we had a good time just getting together and learning a little English and cooking and that kind of stuff. I had a lot of time to practice the piano. And that was really great. I enjoyed that a lot. So I practiced a lot of organ music because I'm currently into learning more organ repertoire. And I also wrote some variations on the alma mater that you'll get to hear in the April Fool's concert in April. So that was a lot of my activity there.
Where was the piano?
In the apartment, this was a great blessing, because pianos are not that common in Russia. And for the piano to be left in the apartment for us by our landlord was, I think, quite amazing. So I was very happy. I think I might have gone stir crazy if I did not have the piano in the apartment, because I had a lot of time to fill. I filled that with sweeping the rugs with a broom, since I didn't have a vacuum cleaner. These are pictures of our apartment, just in case you're wondering. Nice little kitchen. A fairly big dining room. By Russian standards, this is a large dining room. We had a Thanksgiving dinner for like 12 people there and managed to all fit in. The inside of the apartment was much more appealing than the outside of the apartment. When we first drove up, I thought, oh boy, what are we getting ourselves in for? But that's sort of a standard Soviet-looking apartment in Astrakhan. Not well kept, a little shabby around the edges. But fortunately, the inside of the apartment was very, very comfortable, and we were very, very glad that we had that.
It was secure.
And it was secure, yes. That door, you have a little magnetic button to get in. And it turns out that apartment cost, we paid $650 a month rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. And we had dinner with one of the one of the Russian teachers at the university, and she told us her monthly salary was about $240 a month. So, you think about the housing situation in Russia. The average teacher makes $300-400 a month, maybe. They say doctors make maybe about that. Doctors are not paid much more than teachers. So, the average doctor's salary might be $400 or $500 a month. And so you can see why housing, there's a serious issue with housing in Russia with the economy the way it is. So I also did a lot of cooking. We went to the market. We had a large market just 3 minutes away from our house that came every Friday and Saturday. We had another market that was 5 minutes walk from our house. It was available every day. There were markets all over the place and little kiosks where you could buy things. So we enjoyed going to the market, and the people thought it was very funny to have Americans who couldn't speak a word of Russian trying to buy things in the marketplace. Lots of color. Eggs were sold by the 10, so for 37 rubles you could bring your own container and take some eggs home. In fact, in Russia, you take your own bags to the marketplace and the supermarkets. At the supermarkets, if you don't have your own bag, then you have to pay for every bag that you take. So we carried bags with us, and
it's about 30 rubles per dollar.
Lots of big bags of potatoes. They like pickled things in Russia, so this is a stand of all pickled items, pickled mushrooms, pickled green tomatoes. You know, I saw pickled garlic, pickled hot peppers, cabbage, carrots, broccoli, cauliflower, just all variations on pickled something or other. This is the honey man. He had big metal tubs of honey that he would ladle out for us. And when we went to buy honey for the first time, you could obviously tell we were not Russian. And so when we got up, and he had given us taste. He had little pieces of paper. He'd give you a couple of samples. You could taste the honey and order the one that you wanted. And he wouldn't let us pay, which was quite generous, because honey is actually pretty expensive over there. And so we thought that was real sweet. So I was baking bread with the honey. I had lots of time to bake homemade bread. So I made a loaf of bread and then took him a loaf of bread. Then he gave me some more honey. So then I gave him another loaf of bread. So we appreciated that very much. The Russians are known to be generous people. This was our meat man. You can see the stump with the cleaver behind there where they would, he was amazingly good at doing 2-inch roasts off of that slab of meat with that huge cleaver. This is an indoor market. They have several huge indoor market areas that are open every day, and these, dried fruits and nuts and that kind of thing. We found almost everything we really needed in Astrakhan. Except peanut butter. And then we slowly made our way to the supermarkets. We started out thinking, this might be a real hardship here. But we found 4 major supermarkets in the city that had just about everything. I even found tortilla chips that were made in Sweden. And they had 16 different languages on the package. That was my all-time record. You could, the table of contents on this side, you went through, and it was, and I count through all these. It was really quite fun. And the salsa was from Sweden also. It didn't taste exactly like American salsa. Here's another one. So the Russians are coming up in the consumer world here. So we spent a lot of time shopping, actually, and spending time walking around the city and trying to learn as much as we could about the history and the people, and attending a lot of events. So John's going to go on about more of the historical aspects of this city.
I mentioned, first of all, that Astrakhan is about 500,000 population, so it's a good-sized city, bigger than Rochester, for example. And so it has many of the amenities that you would expect in a city of that size, musically and socially and educationally as well, with some major educational institutions. But it has quite an interesting and a long history. It was conquered by the Russians in the late 1500s, 1558. They just celebrated their 450th year under Russian rule 3 years ago. Russia was concerned about having access to and control of the Volga for its entire length. And so they took it from the Khanates, the Golden Horde group of civilizations that had been there historically before that time. Incidentally, this area was on the Silk Road to China from Europe, and there were caravans that came through this area at that time as well. But when the Russians took it over, they immediately started to build a Kremlin. Many Americans think of one Kremlin, the Kremlin in Moscow. But if you've traveled in Russia, you know that there are multiple Kremlins, that most major cities historically that were in existence through the Middle Age period had a Kremlin, which is simply a fortified area in the oldest part of the city, often in a higher space that is defensible. And so the Russians built the Kremlin in the late 1500s, And the Kremlin still exists today. It's been restored several times. The walls rebuilt a couple of times. A few of the towers that were starting to crumble been rebuilt as well. But it's a very interesting combination of Russian military and church and government all combined into one. It contains about 17 acres. We're looking south in Astrakhan. The Volga River, the main stem of the Volga River, is to the right. And so the north wall of the Kremlin there is in the foreground. And the major part of the old city, the commercial area, and the area with the oldest buildings is to the left, which would be toward the east in Astrakhan. But the Kremlin encloses two major cathedrals, as well as two smaller chapels. It encloses a prison area that included a torture tower here in the at the bottom. This tower is now a museum that includes several torture items that were used through the Middle Ages to torture prisoners. This is an artillery yard. There was a military barracks area, but there was also a monastery complex here and a classic Russian cathedral with its bell tower that also functions as the main gatehouse for the Kremlin. If you've traveled in Eastern Europe, you know that Orthodox churches usually have a separate bell tower. It's unusual to have the bells on the same building as the church itself. And often that separate bell tower serves as an entryway into the enclosure around the church itself. This is the north wall of the Kremlin with a nice garden area next to it that also has some souvenir stands. And the tower here, which was a gate tower, the second story is a small chapel that just has a Russian Orthodox chapel that just has services on special feast days. I happened to come into the Kremlin at one point and noticed that chapel was open, and went in and found that there was a priest and three singers, a women's trio singing the vocal responses, and there were three congregants. Another wall. Here Laurel is waiting for public transport at one of the bus stops in the center part of the city. Our major source of transportation was not a car. I didn't drive a car for 3 months while we were in Astrakhan. But we rode on these minibus vans called marshrutkas. There were at least 100 different routes that ran different directions through the city. There was a nice interactive online website where you could click on two locations in the city. It would tell you which marshrutka number you should wait for, and showed its route on the map as well. So we would take marshrutkas, which had a fare of about 40 cents to get from any point along their route to any other point. You could stop any time by asking the driver to stop. You could flag them down at any point along the route. So you were not restricted to just bus stops. So it was, in a sense, like a shared taxi that was running a fixed route. This is the outside of the bell tower gatehouse, main gate entrance to the Kremlin. A very ornate Baroque building. It was built in the early 1900s, though, to match the architecture of the nearby cathedral because the previous bell tower gatehouse was starting to crumble. Here's a view along the wall of the Kremlin from the torture tower corner. Along the wall, you can see in the foreground to the gatehouse bell tower in the distance. This is the Cathedral of the Assumption, which Peter the Great called, when he came to Astrakhan at one point, the most beautiful cathedral in Russia. It's really a gorgeous piece of architecture built in the early 1600s. It dates from about 1610. It was started in the late 1500s as the wall was being built. I also read that the Kremlin in Astrakhan is probably the second oldest of about 20 existing Kremlins that still are intact in Russia. It was built on the frontier to protect the Volga River from invaders trying to move up the river. It was built on the highest point in Astrakhan, which is only maybe 30 or 40 feet above the rest of the city. Here's a view from the plaza inside the Kremlin of the Cathedral of the Assumption and its bell tower as well. There was a separate church in the lower area, the first level of this building, that had services every day, but the upstairs was only used for special occasions and feast days especially. And like many Russian Orthodox churches in Russia, this one was taken over by the Soviets during the Soviet era and was just used for storage and for occasional public meetings. It was only returned to Orthodox church use in the early 1990s.
So they're still doing renovation on the upper level, which is not finished yet.
This is an unused side door to that church, a very ornate doorway, and there's beautiful details like this all around the building. And then across the plaza from the Cathedral of the Assumption is the monastery complex, and this is Trinity Cathedral. It currently has not been restored and is not in use by the Orthodox Church. They just whitewashed the outside basically for the 450th anniversary of the city, when they did a lot of sprucing up and a lot of renovation inside the Kremlin as well as in other parts of the city. But these other areas were dormitories and other quarters for the monks who lived here at the time when it was a monastery. This also dates from the early 1600s. And this whole Kremlin complex was about a 25-minute walk from our apartment. So I went there often. We went there often together. It didn't cost anything to enter the grounds. Some of the other buildings in the Kremlin were used for museum purposes. There was also a music school. The kind of school that gave music lessons to children was in one of the barracks buildings there as well. The interior was park-like in some areas. This is looking across from the east to the west to one of the other gatehouses, which is also a museum. The next segment before I start it is a video of the City Day of Astrakhan. Astrakhan is very proud of its history, and every year it celebrates its birthday in early October by having a weekend festival called City Day. And on City Day, they have a lot of public events going on, concerts and fireworks along the river, usually at night, those kinds of things. And we have just a short clip showing a traditional song and dance act at City Day for the 453rd anniversary of the founding of Astrakhan. This was sponsored by the company Gazprom, and you'll see their logo on the backdrop. Technical issue here. Doesn't want to stay there, does it? Okay. Let's try it again. Astrakhan is dominated by the Volga River. Economically, culturally, a lot of the activities and specializations of that city revolve around the Volga River. There are cruise boats like this one that run the length of the Volga, all the way from near Moscow on an 8 or 10-day cruise, stopping at the historic sites along the Volga is a popular route in the summertime. There are very large commercial vessels that go through the city that are bringing imports in and taking exports out to the countries around the Caspian. You can see the towers of the Kremlin there in the background, the main bell tower and the church itself as well. This is the pedestrian zone along the Volga, a very pleasant area to spend an evening to watch the sun go down over the Volga, which is to the west. And there's also some major boat yards and warehousing areas with huge cranes that are on and offloading all kinds of industrial goods. You can see some church towers. The Kremlin towers are just behind this crane here. So the Kremlin is visible from most of the city. The university I taught at was founded as a fisheries institute back in about 85 years ago. They just celebrated their 85th birthday. And they have a marine engineering program similar to SUNY Maritime near New York City. And this is one of their 2 large boats that they use for that program. A couple of weeks after we arrived, they offered Laurel and I a private cruise on the university boat. And so we took this boat around the city through some of the canals, and especially we went looking for the lotus, because the lotus is one of the major attractions in this part of the world. Lotus is a beautiful flower that grows in very large beds in wetland areas and shallow water. And Astrakhan has the northernmost lotus fields in the world. The delta itself has thousands of acres of lotuses that bloom in late summer. The peak of the bloom is late August, and this event brings tourists who come just to see the lotus fields. There's a very small lotus field right in Astrakhan in the city. We couldn't travel, we found out, to the delta area because it's a sensitive area, being on the border for foreigners to travel to without special advance permission. So this university boat took us to the lotus field right in the city, and it was past the main bloom for the lotus, but there were still a few lotus blooms hanging on. So I went out, waded through the mud, got off the boat, and went into the lotus field. These are some lotus blossoms up close. The bloom itself is much bigger than a tulip, somewhat tulip-shaped. But you can see the iconic seed heads there as well, which are often used in dried flower arrangements. And fishing is a major part of the economy in Astrakhan, historically as well as currently. There was a large daily fish market inside, just about a 10-minute walk from our apartment. The fish were mostly dried, but there were also some of them that were smoked and salted, including some large, really prehistoric-looking sturgeon. Sturgeon was sort of the center and the specialty of the fishing in Astrakhan, including the eggs of the sturgeon, which of course are the caviar. Astrakhan was known as the source of the most of and the best caviar in Russia for many, many years. But unfortunately, especially since the collapse of the communist era in the early 1990s, overfishing and poaching have been rampant. And it's now illegal to sell the black caviar, the best caviar, because they're trying to allow that particular type of sturgeon to recover from years of overfishing. And the university where I taught still has a graduate level fisheries program, and they have research tanks of sturgeon that they're raising there and then releasing into the wild in an attempt to restore the population of the sturgeon. These are immense fish in their maturity, maybe 6 or 8 feet long in some cases, and hundreds of pounds. And one female sturgeon, when she's gravid, pregnant, can contain about $5,000 worth of caviar, upwards from that. And so you can see it's quite a temptation for a fisherman who might catch a large sturgeon to release it back into the water because it's illegal to have that caviar. There are some very pleasant walkways along the canals in the city, and some very nice downtown areas as well. The historic center of the city is in very good condition in general. It's been restored and a pleasant place to walk. This is Pushkin Park, dedicated to the poet Pushkin. Some of the historic Baroque-era buildings of the center part of the city. This is the medical academy with some of the medical students coming out from classes. There was one area, like many European cities, that was closed to vehicular traffic. It was a pedestrian area. And you could rent horseback rides, especially for the kids. They had electric-powered cars for the kids to drive around in this area as well. This is a restored mansion of a rich merchant from the late 1800s, which is now a museum. We heard that this was home for 7 families during the Soviet era. This is the Soviet-era wedding palace. Most large cities in the former Soviet Union have a secular wedding palace like this, where newlyweds would go to get their marriage licenses and to have their secular wedding ceremony. They might have a separate religious ceremony then in one of the churches. A shopping complex, a nice pedestrian area along the Volga with a nice fountain, and a large new musical theater that was just completed while we were there. Very ornate. Cost estimates were $60 to $80 million, and they just had their grand opening while we were there. Baroque style. But just down the street are buildings like this. So the contrasts in Astrakhan were often quite abrupt, going from very nice sections to rundown 100 or 150 or 200-year-old homes. A view of some of the residential sections of Astrakhan. Often the streets were not paved or were torn up for an extended periods of time. But there were some very nice examples of traditional Russian wooden house architecture. Most of these were built in the late 1800s, and some of them have been maintained nicely. Others have been allowed to run down. Even a log cabin. Now, at this point, Laurel's going to talk about some of the ethnomusicology that we experienced.
We were very pleased that it appears there is a very active sort of artistic and musical life in Astrakhan. And very soon after we got there, they had a folk festival that was like 4 nights of free performances. Some were in the Kremlin, and some were in the symphonic hall of the symphony there. So we're going to try to show you a few clips of, very short clips of some things that we think you might find interesting. There, we didn't get the best part, but it's hard to, when you're at a concert. They were all professional musicians who were playing traditional Russian music. That was another sort of Russian stringed instrument that we don't actually know the name of ourselves. It was very... And so now we're just going to show you, we're running out of time. We tried very hard to condense this into the time frame, but we're going to move quickly into some of the churches, the Orthodox churches, just so you can see some of the pictures. This one was like 10 minutes or less from our house. We went here several times on a Sunday morning to stand for an hour or more while they had church, because nobody sits during an Orthodox church except for very old ladies, and there's like 3 chairs or so. So I was wondering about that myself. I'm hoping he had his earplugs in. Outside the churches there often were older ladies begging. And this one was quite friendly and quite cheerful. And with my limited Russian, I still managed to tell her who we were and why we were in Astrakhan. And she was very, very sweet. So I just thought I'd show a picture of a nice Russian lady there. This is another one of the churches in Astrakhan. The inside. The pews, since there are no pews, do not obscure the view, right? This is the Prince Vladimir. This is one that was just recently returned to church use and still is in great need of renovation. It was used as the bus station during the Soviet era. This is a beautiful one.
St. John the Baptist?
I can't keep the name straight.
Inside of the same church.
But then this is the neighborhood around the church. It's always such a contrast. If you only show, the good part, you don't really get the context. This is the Catholic Church. This was used as a warehouse during the Soviet Union. We went to 2 concerts in the church, and you could see from about 5 feet down, all the plaster was very seriously damaged, but the rest of the church was still quite beautiful. And so this has been returned to the use of the church. This is another St. Chrysostom.
St. John Chrysostom.
More bells. We took lots of pictures of bells. There were 3 mosques in the old section of Astrakhan, so we didn't get into them. We weren't sure of how well that would be received, so we just took pictures of the outsides. We did go to 1 soccer game. And this sort of leads us into the current situation with sort of the security issues in Russia and police presence. There were 300 policemen at this soccer game with an Italian team. They all had guns, flak jackets, helmets, sticks, and everything. It was very cold, 28 degrees, and we got pretty cold because we really didn't take enough winter clothes with us. We were hoping it didn't get that cold before we had to come back. And we left, and then the next day we were told that there was actually a riot in the second half. And so the policemen were prepared. That's why they were there. But it's quite a situation to see so many policemen around. And Russia has one of the highest police force, per capita of any country in the world. It's part of the keeping order. So John's going to talk very briefly about the political situation that we found there.
This is a political rally that was held on a holiday called Unity Day in Russia that just was observed before the Russian Revolution and after the communist era fell. The banners say United Russia, which is the ruling party of Russia, Vladimir Putin's party. Excuse me. And as you probably know, there's been some recent unrest, a considerable amount of unrest in Russia as a result of an election that was held about 4 days after we left in late November. We had a Fulbright gathering in Moscow where we had an expert on Russian politics talk to us about the political system. And he called their system of government a managed democracy, with the emphasis on being managed. It's not a very open system, and there's a lot of corruption. And we found out that the general citizen population, the folks that we got to know, were very cynical about any chance for change and any input they could have into changing the system in Russia. We talked to a lot of people who were quite pessimistic and were looking for ways to get out of the country, get out of the system if they could. But life goes on, but there is a lot of corruption and especially cronyism, it appears, in the current system, where jobs are handed off. Government appointees are given to business associates and friends, and money and power are concentrated in the hands of a few at the top. But the economy is much stronger than it used to be, especially because of the oil money and the fact that the Caspian Basin has a lot of oil wealth, and so that is contributing to the prosperity of this area. That's all we'll say for now. Be glad to take any questions.